Anyway, the goal of this training is that you have the tools to either write more effectively an LTE or op-ed if you have written one. I know probably many of you here have already written an op-ed or LTE, just to refresh your memory about it, or if it's your first time and you want to go for it, hopefully this will give you some more tools and tips. I will also be giving you all a lot of other structural tips that I'll go through and examples, which I'll put into an email afterwards. So if you're really tired and you don't retain all the information and want to look it over because you're writing or you want help with editing, I will be giving you all that information. Last cohort, we actually did an advocacy through writing campaign in which every week we send out different news articles that people could choose to comment on and different tips and tricks. And we had a few ambassadors submit or practice writing LTEs and op-eds, which is a lot of fun. So this is kind of a typical slide you've probably seen every training involving climate and health and yada, yada, yada. But this is just about why your voice matters. I think this is not just if you're a health professional, but in general, why it's so powerful to be able to use writing as a tool for advocacy is because it can be a really compelling and effective way to share about your personal lived experience. It can be a platform to give voice to others. It could be your patients or your community or whatever issue you think is really, really important that people know about. And I think it can provide a unique perspective from a reporter and also, as trusted messengers of information to the general public, I think in general, health professional voices are highly valued. And I think, health professionals often have a big empathy for people, and that really can shine through in writing. And we also are usually trained and hopefully trained in writing to some extent. Also, I forgot to mention, if you have questions, comments, whatever, and you've written and you want to add anything, please raise your hand because it's a little hard for me to manage chat at the same time. So I'm going to be going through differences between LTEs and op-eds. So first, what is a letter to the editor, the basic thing. I was gonna ask you all what you think, and you can add to this if you want to add anything throughout the training. But the short answer is that a letter to the editor is a written response to an article printed in a newspaper, a magazine, or other publication. So you are responding to something that's already been printed, which is different than an op-ed. You're going to voice a very clear opinion. So you're going to take a position on an issue, and you might inform or clarify or take the opposite opinion, but generally also providing some type of information. And it's really, really short and concise. So that's actually an example right there. That's how short it can be. It can be 100 words, 150, 300 words. An op-ed is also a form of opinion writing, but it is longer, and it's usually a column that represents a more strong, or is also strong, informed and focused opinion of the writer on an issue of relevance to a targeted audience. Both are to a targeted audience. In general, with op-eds, the author might more typically have expertise in the subject. This is not completely necessary, but often this is the case, or at least someone is researching it more heavily. You will also voice a clear opinion or an ask. A lot of times, both LTEs and op-eds will call on public officials or the government or a paper to do something about a topic, or it could just be really trying to show the public or your intended audience and inform them about a subject they don't know a lot about. It is typically longer than a letter to the editor. I'll talk a little bit more. Why did it do that? Why did it do that? It will typically be about 600, 900 words, but there is flexibility with word count. I'll go over this. It usually depends on the paper. So you just really have to check what the paper submission suggestions are and make sure that they are within that. But typically 600 to 900 words, which is a bit more lengthy. So you can really write a little bit more. A really important thing to consider before you write either an LTE or op-ed is who is your audience. This might seem like kind of a really simple thing, but I think a lot of us just write because we're like so passionate about an issue before really being like, wait, who is my audience? And obviously you do this for school too, but this is something that, I mean, when I've been writing this op-ed like for a while with someone, we're co-writing an op-ed about reducing plastic waste from pill bottles, from, you know, all the prescriptions. It's a lot of plastic waste. And I'm looking it over now. We're like, well, who is our audience? You know, who do we want to influence? What do we want to see change? And I think we're kind of working through that right now. So both of them are going to be, you know, written to the editor or the news source, but it's really going to be the reader, like who, that's why it's so important to consider who you're pitching it to or submitting it to, because who are going to be the typical readers of the New York Times versus Fox News versus NPR versus name a news source. So it's really important to consider who's going to be reading that publication. And also, if you're doing something more local and you have a local issue, then you might want to pick something local because proximity is important. Then there's different types of audiences, but in general, they're focusing on a narrative change audience, which is basically people you want to motivate to take action. This is more especially for advocacy. So let's say you want your city to create bike lanes, for example. Like, why is that important in the city? I'm just making something up. Who do you want to motivate to take action? Oftentimes, these could be people that know about the issue, but they don't have the tools to really take action. So you're giving them the tools to take action, or they're not informed about it, but they might have the ability or the power to take action. Or it could just be you're just informing different people. So there's different types of audiences that you can look at, but in general, it's people you want to motivate to take action or have more of an understanding of the issue. So the things to think about, demographics and geography. As I said, local versus national. What are the values of the audience? Do you want that to be aligned? Do you want to kind of strike a chord within them? Think about culture and pop culture and what's influencing different opinions. Unfortunately, we are incredibly divided bipartisan country, as you know. So it is important to understand what's going on. And that's why the gas stoves, which you'll have a practice at today, is an important one to understand. What groups might your audience be a part of or intersect with? And then who are you ultimately persuading? Example audiences, you see this also, you know, in a lot of different advocacy, but healthcare professionals, you all, policymakers, local citizens, researchers, people who are granting money, parents, you know, those are a really important audience. Also, for those of you who came in, feel free to add comments, raise your hand, just shout out, because it's hard for me to man the chat, as you know, when you lead a presentation. So this is also, I'm kind of putting these side by side, just so you have a little bit better understanding. I think you can read this, but a big difference, I think, is that the LTE is usually just very recent. So you got to be like, okay, this article is in the news. I'm going to respond to it quickly. It's really short. You have to be kind of fast, which can be hard when you're in school and you have other stuff going on. And you care, like you really care about the issue, but you don't have to share deep expertise. Now, it is important that you should still put your credentials. So if you're a med student or you are a social worker, I'm looking at Alex, I'm just like looking at what everyone does, or you're a veterinarian, like you should still put that there so the audience knows, but it's not as important because you're not usually sharing deep expertise. You could be a concerned citizen. I'll show you an example, but that's just something to keep in mind. This op-ed, you don't have to be as much in a rush, and you're writing a new thing. So it's not like you have to respond to an already written article. And it is important, I think, to be an issue expert, as I said, or have really researched that subject. I'm not an expert on reducing plastic waste from pill bottles, but we've been researching this for about a year and, you know, have done a lot of literature searches. So that's an example of something. I'm not an issue expert, but I've been doing a lot of research for a while on it. Okay, so we're going to go into kind of individual, you know, writing an LTE versus op-ed. As I said, it's just been mentioned in the paper. You're really going to make one or two important points very succinctly. You can submit your LTE quickly. And I know it says you can write well. I think it's more important, like for the op-ed, to be really proficient writer. That is not something that I can teach you overnight. I trust that you all have been practicing writing from school. But as long as you care and you have a point of view and you want to practice, then I say go for it. So this is a little bit about a structure. Now, I mean, this is a general structure. I'm sure you don't have to do exactly this, but this is generally how they will look if you read through a bunch of LTEs, and I'll give you archives. I can give you tons and tons and tons of LTEs to read if you'd like, which I do recommend if you've never written it before, is to read. So you're always going to begin with a hook. But I think the main thing is it's so short. You want to restate the issue as you understand it. So fracking is a dangerous practice that is hurting our community. It could be similar to an opening that you would put in a public comment, for an example. You also want to make sure at the top that you're citing the specific article, the editorial's name and date, because you're responding to an article. So make sure you put that in. Then in building your case, you want to only really make one, maybe two significant points, but you could put a few different sentences that support that one significant point. But when you're writing a paragraph, for example, and you have like a thesis statement, you really only want to have like one key thing that you're writing. You could be, these are examples, refuting erroneous information. There is a lot of false news. You could be doing that. You could be providing a better interpretation of facts or adding your expertise to it. So for example, I'll be giving you a few articles about gas stoves, and you could add, okay, these are some more health effects as a health professional that I know about, that I've learned about, that I want to add to this article. Think about it as like you're having a conversation, or think about like Reddit, or when people are on Facebook and they're like arguing about like one article forever in the comment section. That's kind of how I think about LTE a little bit, is like you're providing your angle to a larger story that you think can influence the public opinion. And use your own voice. I think that the best LTEs and the best writing have emotion to it, have that lived experience. And so, yeah, use your own voice. And also call to action. I really think this is important for both op-eds and LTEs, specifically for LTEs, and really try to end with a concrete call to action about what you want the reader or paper or policymaker, whoever, to do. All right, a few tips and tricks. I'm going over these. These are just kind of bullet points. Make sure you reference the article, as I said, address only one issue. This is actually really hard. I'm a writer I write a ton and then I condense it. So I find LTE writing actually more difficult, because I'm more of someone who wants to write like a full op-ed and put all the flowery language in. But for this, it's like texting versus emailing. That's kind of what I think about it as. You really want to explain why it's important. The reader, is going to take them probably 2 minutes to read this, and then they'll have like a strong, motivation hopefully afterwards. Read. I would say read different ones so you can get the idea of how quick and concise they are. It could be, once again, it could be a little more than 300 words. There might be space, but it really depends on that paper. So you can email them if you don't know, if it doesn't say. Then when writing an op-ed, I'm going to go over the structure as well, but you want to establish your expertise to maintain credibility. If you are going to be referencing like patient stories, which can be really effective, you want to obviously make sure that you maintain confidentiality, HIPAA, or you obtain patient permission, or let's say you're doing field work or community organizing, that you are ensuring that whoever you're representing is okay with this. A lot of times people will actually co-author op-eds. I've seen this before. Let's say it's a healthcare professional that's working with an environmental justice community. I think a really powerful technique that's being used more is co-authorship, where it's not just the health professional or the person with more power who's writing on behalf or adding quotes in, but it's really those two people together writing an op-ed. And I can find examples of that, but I think those are really powerful if you ever have a patient or somebody you want to work with. So you can totally co-write op-eds. 600 to 800 or 900 words, I would say, is optimal. I'll show you one that's 700, and I think it's a really good sweet spot. Because you are healthcare professionals, really avoid medical jargon, which can be really tough because it's so ingrained in you that you're like, oh, someone else doesn't know what COPD is, but like the general public probably doesn't understand as much as you think. So dumb it down. And yeah, as for both, it's an opinion piece. So your unique voice really does matter. This you can say, for an LTE as well, but just something, other questions like, why should the readers trust you? Like, why do you have credibility? Why is it important that you're writing this? Can you back up what you say? Op-eds usually have, some citations in it, some research. It doesn't have to be super research heavy, but usually they'll have some, extra information from other sources. What's new? How does this provide an original take? Usually op-eds are a little bit more original, or they're really, instead of like adding and replying to it, you're kind of coming up with something new that maybe people haven't considered as much. Are you really just arguing for the sake of arguing? Are you being effective? And like, how are you contributing to the conversation or starting a new conversation? And is this going to be helpful for your audience? These are a little bit vague questions, but just something to consider while you're writing and thinking. So this is a little bit about a structure for op-ed. Similar to the LT, there are some similarities, but you can obviously use your own stylistic voice. This is not as, it's prose, but it's not, you're not writing an essay, but this is gonna feel a little bit more similar to an essay writing, I think. I don't think it should sound as academic, but you're gonna have a hook like you do with the LTE. I would say one thing that's really important, I'll say this over again, is that you actually can write out in the op-ed, I'm a doctor and I did this, or I'm a community member and I've experienced this. And that's, you don't really have that space to do in the LTE, but when you establish the expertise early on, the audience trusts you and really wants to listen to what you have to say. I mean, imagine it's just like a person who's just writing versus someone's like, oh, I'm a researcher at this, and I've been researching this for my career or whatever, you trust them more. Like an LT, you're gonna have a thesis, but you can have more points. So usually you could use like 3 points, kind of like each paragraph could be a different point with different evidence. And then this is just like a to be sure, try to address also, okay, what might be a counter argument that someone might have and how can I address that? And then a conclusion, and make sure you circle back to your hook, and you can end with a call to action as well. So now we're going to go through getting your LTE and op-ed published, which is another step. You're not just like submitting your essay to your professor, but you're really trying to get it published. I think the big thing is just try, and it could be a really, really good LTE or op-ed, but the paper might not have enough space, or there might be a lot of people responding to the issue, or they might be understaffed. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not really well written. There was an ambassador last year who wrote a fabulous LTE. I was like almost positive it would be published because he responded right away. He wrote it really well, and it didn't get published, and we published it on our website, but that's just an example. I think also the local ones are probably more likely to get published for LTEs if it's like something to do with your own community. So proximity matters. And yeah, you normally should just, you're going to submit to one paper. So if you don't get published, then maybe you can try another paper or just email again. What I would, for an LTE, usually there's like a submission form on the website versus an op-ed is usually an email you have to send. But if you have any questions, I recommend trying to find a contact person, or just seeing, like, search on the website. Everything is usually online these days. See if there's just like a way that you can respond, and make sure that you can submit an LTE. And then in terms of an op-ed, you're actually gonna email a pitch. I can send more resources about an effective pitch. But you're kind of doing a concise, it's like an abstract that you would write for the paper that you're contacting. Like, why should they care? Why should they publish this piece? Why are you the most important person who should be writing this? Or why would you be a good author for this? So it's going to be concise, but basically like a little abstract about the piece, and also make sure you have your credentials. And I think one thing that really matters in op-eds is just the originality of it. It doesn't have to be like completely new, but I just think the more original it is, in general, news sources are like this, and think about yourself as someone who's looking through podcasts or looking at news articles to read. In general, we gravitate towards novel, we gravitate towards things that catch our eyes. And I think that's just something to think about when you write these. All right. Why? Okay. These are a few of the top new US news outlets. I recommend starting locally, but these are some ones that could be good to strive for. And I would also recommend looking at these are more left leaning, most of them. So for probably the advocacy work you're doing, it might be better. But I'm actually going to give you a Fox News article that one group will practice for their LTE, which I think is kind of fun. But these are just a few ones that, are not they're easy to submit to, might be more competitive, but these are just some top US news outlets. But the op-ed project has a list of a lot of different ones that they recommend. It's like it's probably maybe 100 or hundreds. So more information about writing an LTE. This is the PSR website where there's a lot of guidelines. And then I think the best is the op-ed project, which I have pulled a lot of information from. And I actually think they might actually have like editors that you can work with there, if I remember correctly. So they have they're really invested in having a lot of people gain skills to be advocates through writing. So I think they are a fabulous source of information. So now I'm going to give you just two examples. Let me just, I'm going to try to post these in the chat just so you can look them over. So the first one is also written by someone in the PSR community about curbing methane emissions. And the reason why I think this one is good to read is it provides, like, this guy's from Ohio, and he just really succinctly talks about why it's really important to curb methane emissions. So let me I'm going to put these all in the chat after, actually. I think that's going to be a better use of my time. But with everyone, some of them get published. This one's a little bit more detail and research oriented, I think. But I think what's great is that it really draws the reader in with a compelling warning. You could just also use an ask or an action. He doesn't really specifically say like, oh, let's do this. It's more of like a warning about what will happen if they don't curb methane emissions. The second one, which was really great, this was actually published by an ambassador in the last cohort. I think a few of you are in Baltimore. This ambassador has actually been creating a citywide composting map and organizing for different local food businesses to compost. And so she and her co-author basically talk about what's the state of composting right now in Baltimore, and why is it really important to implement this. I do think that one thing this op-ed could benefit from is providing expertise. Venelo was a med student, I think her co-author was too, and they never really mention that, or they don't really mention what they're doing until further on. So that's one thing I think could benefit. But I really like the fact that this one ends with a succinct ask of the city's government. So I'm gonna post those two in the chat so you can look it over. But before we go to a little exercise for you all, I want to stop sharing for a second and then leave time for some questions or just like some comments. Like I would love if any of you have written an LTE or op-ed. This is also like, you know, I'm giving you an overview, and you know how writing works. You could like teachers can give handouts upon handouts to students, and they're going to have to practice. So, but I would love if any of you could share any LTEs or op-eds that you've tried to write, or any tips and tricks that you have. I'm gonna stop sharing, and feel free to just like raise your hand or whatever. If anyone's written one and they want to post it in the chat or anything. Nah? Okay. Give me 1 second. I'm gonna post these ones in the chat so that you can get an idea for what they look like. So I'm gonna give the citywide composting one is like 700 words, so it's a little bit longer. And then the other one is pretty short because it's an LTE. Oh yeah, Marisa.
Hi, Becca. Thank you so much for this. This is so helpful. I was just going to add that I've written like a couple of op-eds at my last job, and I think that you're totally right that like knowing your audience is a really important part of it. And I think you said this as well, but the other thing that like stood out to me from that experience was like having a hook, which could be like either that like the thing you're writing about is in the news, or like there's something relevant about it that you can kind of hook onto as a way to like convince readers that this is important and especially relevant at this current time. That's just like one more thing I got.
Yeah, thanks so much. You mind sharing? I know Brianna, I see your hand as well. Do you mind sharing what you wrote about for your op-eds?
Yeah, I can try to find the link. I wrote one last year for a bill that I co-wrote it with one of my supervisors, and it was about a bill that we were working on in Albany, about the fashion industry supply chain, and making industry more sustainable. And also it's a bill that would make the whole supply chain like report and decrease their emissions and their both environmental and like labor impact.
That's awesome. And do you want to talk a little bit about the process of like some, you know, pitching and whether there was any response to the article?
Yeah, in terms of like pitching it to the paper, I think we did it in like the Times Union, so a local paper. This was at an organization where we had a whole communications department, and so they really handled the process of like getting it published. So I don't really know what that whole process is like. And then in terms of reaction, I don't think we got like, I didn't hear a lot of reactions and stuff, but I do think that in terms of like this as a piece of the advocacy we were working on, I think like our audience was kind of the politicians. And so having them see that this is an issue that's important to constituents and so important that it's being written about in local papers, that was kind of our like reason for doing that, for publishing it in the first place. And I think the bill hasn't passed yet, but that's like standard, I think. But I do think it was helpful in kind of like showing the urgency and like garnering some momentum.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I have one more question. I know you do a lot of policy and legislative work. Do you have any tips, you know, for writing for audiences who might not have as much of an understanding about the legislative process and bills in general?
Yeah, I think it's good to kind of or to like explain what you're talking about. So like you said earlier, like not get too jargony and stuff like that. I think that's good. And maybe even to like give some background about the legislative process, and, you know, so like you're not jumping in super in the weeds, but you give some background so you can kind of meet people where they are if you're expecting that readers are not going to have the same background that you have.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for sharing. All right, Brianna, you've had your hand raised for a bit.
Oh yeah, no worries. I was just gonna echo a lot of the things that you already said, and Marissa. I wrote an op-ed a couple years ago. It must have been 2020, for Environmental Health News. And kind of like what Marissa was saying, like it was really important for us to include a hook about what was relevant at the time. And so I think the it was published like in June 2020. So we were like in the height of COVID, and there was data starting to come out about like disparities in testing and outcomes for specific populations. And sort of the audience that reads environmental health news, or many people are like scientists, researchers, but then there are also people in the general public as well. So my op-ed was about prioritizing inclusion in environmental health research. So really like making sure that we included Black and Brown folks in environmental health research, since Black and Brown people are generally disproportionately burdened by environmental health disparities. And at the same time, COVID was happening, and we were seeing disparate outcomes among Black and Brown people. And so it was important during that time for me to like be able to kind of make my topic relevant in talking about inclusion. And so that was a way that I was able to do that, by sort of pinging on something that was happening in the moment to get to this larger and broader topic about inclusion and environmental health research. So
That's awesome. And also, if any of you want to share them, I'm happy to disseminate it for everyone. How was it received? Did you?
it was received really well. Shared it broadly with colleagues and on Twitter, and I think it was received really well. I mean, I didn't get any negative feedback. I think the important piece, and you touched on it, was obviously you want to pull in data and you want to pull in like fact-based information, but it's really important to like tie your role to what you're talking about. So during that time, I was a research manager, and so a lot of my role was recruiting patients into our environmental health studies and doing a lot of the work in the outreach to make sure that we were including Black women in our studies. And so I was able to pull from my experiences doing some of that work, and the efforts and the intentionality that our research team did to make sure that our program was inclusive and was diverse. And I think that really helped to drive home the point, because I was able to give examples and stories and show that like this work is actually really important and it advances the science. So I guess not being afraid to pull from your experiences, because that's what's gonna like help connect your broader point. So I think that people really, in terms of the feedback that I received, I think that people really enjoyed sort of hearing how I was connecting my argument to my everyday work.
That's wonderful. I'm really glad to hear that it was well received. And yeah, I really liked how much you mentioned using your personal experience and voice, because ultimately, I mean, all of us are health professionals, but we're people first. So that's really awesome. Anyone else have any stories or experiences of trying to publish or submit any op-eds or LTEs before we do a little group activity? Okay. All right. So this is the little activity I thought of. So you are welcome to afterwards write an LTE or op-ed, but this is not, something that you have to do. This is optional. So this is more of an activity to get your brains working, and you'll be working in groups about how you would structure an LTE. You could write out one. You'll have about 15-ish minutes. So or 15-ish, 20-ish minutes. So you could write it out if you want, and co-write LTE if you'd like. Some of them are really recent. I chose 3 different ones. So each group, I'll put you in 3 groups, and each one will get a different one. Let me share my screen again so you'll know what I'm talking about. One second. Give me 1 second to go back to the slideshow. Anyways, each group will get a different relevant gas stoves article. And then you'll just be able to use the structure that I've given or provided for the LTE. I'll put a few things in the chat. I'm going to be putting the health effects primer of gas stoves there, so you can refer to that. A lot of it, that was what Zach talked about in his training a couple weeks ago. But you can just use your own experience and make it like 150 to 300 words if you're going to write it out, or if not, you can kind of just talk about how you would form an LTE in response to each article. So take a few minutes in your groups to read through the article. I tried to choose ones that were relatively short, and then you can have one person write it out if you want, or you can just come back and we'll share. So you'll have about 15 minutes, and then we'll share. Give me just a second. I realized. There we go. Can you guys see this, my screen? Is it working?
It just says you've started. Okay, there we go. Yeah.
Okay, good. So
Well, we can see your whole screen, but yeah.
you can, yeah, that's fine. So, but you can see the slideshow. It's just being slow. I don't know why. Okay. If it doesn't work, that's okay. I wanted to show you all the articles, but. Oh, here we go. It's being wonky. Okay. So these are the 3 different articles. So one, this was pretty recent, was that, I don't know if any of you heard about this, but this one city in California gave the celebrity chef Jose Andres. He has a bunch of different restaurants, especially in DC. So, they're trying to push for more electric stoves, but basically he was like, no, gas stoves are easier to cook from, and they gave him an exemption. So this has been in the news. More about kind of, and then the last 2 ones are about like different political ways of like just the culture war of gas stoves in politics. So have fun with this. Group 1 will get California City, Group 2 will get the GOP, and then Group 3 will get the Democratic one. And just have fun. So I will be putting you into random groups. If you do have to leave before, totally good. And then we'll come back and we'll share for a couple minutes and then close. All right. The one thing I'm going to share in the chat right now that you can all use for reference is this health effects. This is also good for if you were to write an op-ed too, I think. Hopefully this is the right. Yeah. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to put you all into groups, and if you have questions, I'll go around to each group and make sure that everyone is doing okay. And I will be posting, like in each group, I will send out the articles.
to changes to the menu, but instead changes to the health of the workers at this restaurant, since they're the ones who would be suffering most of the consequences, and kind of say like, you know, it's the celebrity chef that's putting up this legal fight to have the right to use these gas stoves, and not actually the workers who would be exposed to the gas stoves mostly. So kind of just expose that area and highlight that it's about the health impacts of these workers mostly.
That's awesome. I love how you focus on the workers. I think that will, if you were to write it, I think that would be really a good like 1 point thing, like the main point to take it into to emphasize is the health effects, particularly of the workers. Okay, group 2, I think that was Brianna and Effie and maybe Daniela, if I have everyone. One of you want to briefly say?
Yeah, I can come and talk about it a bit. Yeah, so we had an article about the GOP basically being super opposed to, you know, all of the regulations that are coming out around gas stoves. Just a lot of inflammatory language about, you know, the Biden administration coming for the gas stoves, and how it just seems incredibly unfair to them. But we ultimately also just were talking about how we could add to this article in terms of just bringing forward the health issues that come along with gas stoves, because it's touched a bit in the article, but it's not touched very much. And so just bringing that to light as well.
Yeah, and I know you all brought up that question, you know, isn't it obvious? But I thought this is a more difficult article to respond to, I think, because there's a lot of political language in it too. And so I think some of the heavily political articles is even better just to kind of, okay, health impacts, you know, they're far reaching, they cross the bipartisan divide. And so I think that's a great approach. I know all of us will be talking about health effects, so that's expected. Last group was Alex, Frank, and I can't remember who else. I think, was it you two?
Brianna was with us too, yeah.
Oh, Brianna was
she's
with you,
us.
and then Marisa was with
Yeah.
us. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, well, Brianna had some really good points. I'll just summarize really quickly. So we talked about having the hook. So our article was from the Washington Post, and it was essentially describing the bipartisan divide over is like creating these rules about gas stoves and overreach of the governments, is it not? And just kind of like the side-by-side play-by-play that's been going on. So Brianna had a really good point about, you know, we're talking about raising awareness for people's autonomy to make these decisions. So like letting them know so they can make their own decisions about the gas stoves. But, you know, like the first group was saying, when it comes to people who maybe aren't able to make those decisions for themselves, like restaurant workers, like who needs to be tasked with, you know, that responsibility of protecting them? Like, does OSHA step in at that point? What do we need to do about that? But just kind of really drawing attention to not everybody has the choice, and we need to make sure that we're including them in the conversation. And Brianna, if I mess that up, you can feel free to jump in.
Oh no, you got it well. And I think that Frank also made a good point of just like thinking about the financial implications of things, and like the benefits, and like sort of the cost analysis of you know, thinking about alternative energy sources, and alternatives of stove options. So I don't know, Frank, if you had anything else you wanted to add, but I thought that was also a really good point.
Yeah, you know, my thought was that in writing like an LTE, if can point out like some of those financial incentives in addition to the health incentives, it can create a new perspective and a different angle for someone to think about. So I think a lot of arguments can fall back on the financial and economic implications, particularly in the short term. So that can be a way to sort of sidestep that rebuttal and say, well, you know, if these changes are made, it's cost saving in terms of down the line after implementation, from the amount of energy that's used, as well as reducing healthcare spending. And it can, have a trickle down effect onto the community because there's less financial strain if you're able to kind of make all those connections and have the evidence to support it.
And not go to the hospital as much for respiratory issues. That'll save you some money there. Yeah, but I think our group, we really tackled, like, if our audience was policymakers, I think would probably.
Oh, thank you for
Mhm.
mentioning your audience.
Exactly.
That was great. Well, I don't want to keep you too much over. I did want to say I really like that you took the financial implications viewpoint. I think the LT too, though, it's hard to do like finance and health, but I think if you can combine it, which it sounds like you did, I think that's really great. So anyways, all of you did a great job. This was really fun. I hope that you enjoyed, and I know a lot of you have already written, but maybe this will excite you to write again. If you wanted to write an LTE or op-ed or try to publish it for your last advocacy action, you can feel free to send to me and I can look it over and have it edited by me and other PSR staff. So that's always an option. Just to wrap up also with some other upcoming events before you all go. Our Climate and Health Opportunities Fair is 2 weeks from today. I'll be sending out, this is optional, I'll be sending out the registration form and the bios of the speakers soon. I think will be great. And then Alex and Jeff, who are not here, they should have sent you an email. I asked if they wanted to send it and they said yes. They're doing an event next week, the Climate Action Party. I'll be there. Zach is moderating. I think will be a great time as well. And then I will be sending you forms regarding like the last progress report and graduation doodle poll. So that's all to come. I'm going to try to space it out so it's not super overwhelming. I should have emailed everyone who hadn't finished advocacy actions, but I'll make sure that everyone gets an email to make sure they're all good. And if you have any questions, please don't feel free to contact me whenever. And that's all. Thank you so much.
Becca,
everyone.
will the slides from tonight be available? Like, will you send
Yes.
those out?
Yeah, I will send
Perfect.
all the slides and all the other resources. Bye, everyone.
Awesome.
Bye, thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you.